The year is 1187. The holy city of Jerusalem trembles. Dust fills the air, swords clash, and prayers echo from every corner. On one side, Crusader knights, desperate and broken. On the other, a commander who would change history forever, Saladin. A man whose name would strike fear in some, but earn respect from all, even his enemies. But across the sea, another king prepares to challenge him, Richard the Lionheart, one of the fiercest warriors Europe ever produced. Their clash was not just a war, it was a test of faith, power, and destiny. And in the end, only one would stand above the other. So, who truly won, the Lionheart, or Saladin, the Sultan who humbled kings? The year is the late 12th century. Europe is restless. Kings, knights, and peasants alike are caught in a storm called the Crusades. A fever that promises salvation, glory, and riches in exchange for blood. Across the Mediterranean, the Islamic world is no less divided. Dynasties fight each other, rival rulers cling to power, and unity seems impossible. Until one man begins to change everything, Salahuddin. With patience, wisdom, and faith, he unites Egypt and Syria under his banner. His presence alone transforms scattered armies into a force bound by purpose. And at the center of this storm lies a city unlike any other, Jerusalem. A city sacred to Muslims, Christians, and Jews. The beating heart of devotion, power, and destiny. But for warriors of this age, Jerusalem was more than stone walls and holy shrines. It was the promise of eternity. For Europe, it meant forgiveness of sins and the glory of Christendom. For Muslims, it was the defense of faith, honor, and a land sanctified by God. This wasn't just a war for territory. It was a war for salvation, for empire, for legacy itself. And on the other side of the world, a king rises. Richard Plantagenet. Better known as Richard the Lionheart. The third son of King Henry II of England. Never meant to rule. Yet fate placed the crown on his head in 1189. But Richard was never truly a king of England. In fact, he spent less than a single year of his reign in his own land. The throne was just a seat, the battlefield was his true home. Tall, fearless, and charismatic, he became the symbol of the knightly ideal. To his soldiers, he was the perfect crusader, a warrior who fought in the front lines, sword flashing, unshaken by fear. But beneath the shining armor lay a harder truth. Richard was obsessed with the crusade. He drained England's coffers, taxed his people to the bone, and even sold royal offices just to fund his holy war. And his ruthlessness was legendary. After capturing Acre, when negotiations with Saladin stalled, Richard ordered the massacre of more than 2,700 Muslim prisoners, men, women, even children. A brutal act that stained his chivalric image forever. He was a lion, yes. But a lion that ruled by fang and claw. A brilliant warrior, unmatched in courage, yet a flawed ruler who abandoned his own kingdom for glory in a foreign land. And then, there was Yusuf ibn Ayyub. The world would remember him by another name, Saladin. He was not born into glory. No crown was waiting for him. What he carried instead was discipline, intelligence, and an unshakable humility. Through loyalty and brilliance, he rose, first in the courts of Egypt, then across Syria, and finally uniting the fractured lands of the Islamic world under a single banner. Where others divided, he brought together. Where others fought for power, he fought for purpose. But it was on the battlefield that his legend was truly written. The year, 1187. The place, the scorching plains of Hattin. Picture it. The Crusader army, armored and proud, dragging the true cross at its center. But the sun was merciless, the wells dry, their throats burning with thirst. Saladin's forces cut off every source of water, tightening the noose like a master strategist. By the end, the proud Crusader host was shattered. Knights collapsed on the sand, parched and broken. The true cross, their sacred relic, was seized. An army once thought invincible was annihilated. And then came Jerusalem. The dream of every crusader, the holy city itself. When Saladin entered, the world held its breath. Many feared the horrors of the past would repeat, for in 1099, the Crusaders had butchered every Muslim and Jew inside its walls. But Saladin chose another path. He showed mercy. Civilians were spared. Christians were allowed to leave safely, their lives intact, their dignity respected. Even his enemies marveled at his honor. This was no ordinary conqueror. This was a man who balanced the sword with the heart, who combined piety with genius, and mercy with might. Saladin was not just a ruler. He was the ideal of leadership itself. And so, the two giants of their age finally faced each other. Not blade to blade, but through armies, strategies, and the sheer force of their names, Richard the Lionheart and Salahuddin. The first great test came at the Siege of Acre, 1191. For 2 long years the Crusaders battered the city. When Acre fell, Richard made his mark, not with mercy, but with blood. Thousands of Muslim prisoners were executed, their bodies left as a grim warning. This was Richard's way, ruthless, decisive, feared. But Saladin did not flinch. He mourned his people, yet he did not break. He tightened his lines, regrouped, and struck again. Then came Arsuf. The desert shook with the thunder of hooves, the clash of steel. Richard's command was brilliant, his knights charging with disciplined fury. Saladin's troops bent under the storm, but they did not shatter. Within days, his army was whole again, ready to fight on. This was their dance, strike and counterstrike, battle and recovery, attack and retreat. And yet, it was more than war. It was psychological. Each knew the other's reputation. Each move was a message. Richard proved he was a master tactician. But for all his victories, for all his courage and cunning, he could not break Saladin's resolve. He could not take back Jerusalem. That city, the prize of empires, the heartbeat of faith, remained firmly in Saladin's hands. The world saw 2 kings clash. One with ferocity. One with endurance. And in the end, endurance held the crown. Strip away the banners, the armies, the clash of steel, and you are left with 2 very different men. Richard the Lionheart. Undeniably brave, almost fearless. But that courage was often reckless, driven by an obsession with personal glory. He poured England's wealth into the crusade, draining his kingdom, leaving his people bankrupt and leaderless. To his subjects, he was more myth than monarch, a king who spent less than a single year on English soil. He wanted victory, not stewardship. And then, Saladin. Measured, patient, devout, his strength lay not only in battle, but in discipline and mercy. He united a fractured Muslim world, not for his own fame, but for faith, for civilization, for something beyond himself. Even his enemies, chroniclers in Europe, wrote of him with admiration. They called him noble, just, even chivalrous. 2 kings, 2 motives. Richard fought for himself. Saladin fought for his people. And in that contrast, history reveals its truth. The sword of fame rusts, but the shield of faith endures. By 1192, the war had drained both sides. Years of bloodshed had scarred the land, villages burned, fields trampled, thousands of men lost to heat, hunger, and steel. Richard's army, once feared across the east, was weary. Supplies dwindled, morale cracked. His homeland too demanded his presence, rebellions threatened England, and his throne was slipping away. And yet, there stood Jerusalem, the dream he had marched for, fought for, bled for. Richard, the Lionheart, stood at the gates of destiny, and knew he could not enter. The city's walls, defended by Saladin's men, were unbreakable. Every path forward meant ruin. Richard, the brilliant warrior who had stormed Acre and crushed at Arsuf, could win battles, but not this war. So the unthinkable happened. The Lionheart sought peace. And Saladin, the Sultan, agreed. But not as a defeated man, as the victor who dictated terms. The city would remain under Muslim rule. Yet, in an act of grace, Saladin allowed Christian pilgrims safe passage to Jerusalem's holy sites. The gates of the sacred city would stay open, but only under the crescent's shadow. When the treaty was signed, the two greatest warriors of their age never met face to face. But their respect was undeniable. Richard sent gifts to Saladin. Saladin sent horses and fruits to Richard. Even in rivalry, they recognized greatness in one another. Richard returned to Europe celebrated as a hero, the Lionheart, the warrior king sung by poets and bards. But in truth, his victory was hollow. He had left his kingdom bankrupt, his people burdened, and Jerusalem beyond his grasp. And Saladin? He remained unchallenged, the true guardian of the holy city. To his people, he was not just a conqueror, he was the protector of faith, the defender of civilization, and the ruler who had faced the might of the West, and stood unbroken. History remembers them both, but not equally. Richard the Lionheart became a legend in songs and stories. Troubadours in Europe sang of his courage, his shining armor, his fearless charge into battle. To the medieval mind, he was the very image of the Night King. But strip away the myth, and the truth is harsher. Richard abandoned his kingdom, spent less than a year in England, and left his people crushed by taxes and debt. His victories dazzled, but they did not last. When he sailed away, the holy city was still beyond his grasp. His glory lived more in legend than in reality. And then, there was Saladin. To his people, he was not just a warrior, he was a unifier, a man of faith, a ruler who embodied discipline and mercy. He was the one who reclaimed Jerusalem without butchery, who showed mercy when others had shown only cruelty. Even his enemies, knights and chroniclers of the Crusades, could not help but admire him. Dante, in his Divine Comedy, placed Saladin in the company of the great heroes of antiquity. Giovanni Boccaccio praised him as a model of nobility. Crusader chroniclers, who once feared him, wrote with awe about his justice, his chivalry, his unmatched dignity. Saladin's name lived far beyond the battlefield. He became a symbol of honor, of justice, of a leader whose greatness transcended the borders of faith and empire. Richard may have been the Lionheart, but Saladin was the legend. Two kings stood upon the same battlefield. One came from the west, armored in pride and legend. The other rose from the east, guided by faith and destiny. Richard the Lionheart fought with fire, chasing eternal glory, but left behind only songs and myths. Saladin fought with patience, mercy, and vision, and left behind a legacy that even his enemies bowed to. History remembers them both. But when the dust of the Crusades settled, only one stood taller than the war itself. Richard may have roared like a lion, but it was Saladin who became the Lion of the Crusades.